Greetings from the Inferno, sometimes referred to as summer in Austin, Texas, and actually it's also a little hot right now behind the Big Bid Theory microphone. Last time out, you may recall we visited with Marcia Matson from Mayor Brown, and among the topics you'll remember, Marcia and I discussed accountability and transparency in government purchasing. This time around, we have an expert on freedom of information, and you may be sitting there, doesn't apply to me. Well, sorry, friend, you think it doesn't. It's kind of one of those things, it doesn't concern you well until it does. Then what? The Freedom of Information Act helps to ensure transparency and openness in government, something we've been talking about here on the Big Bid Theory for a while. You know that. Well, that includes government purchasing, and I'm not sorry to a few of you listening. You know who you are, those who aren't proponents of openness in government and transparency when it comes to government purchasing. The Jim Ward stops by to deliver in our Crazy Bid segment, and actually here in the studio as we went through our production meetings, we held an informal poll, and this Crazy Bids by Jim is the top 3 of all time. We voted. Here in my day job, so many of the people we talk to, and the numbers are significant, we speak with people also known as citizens who experience issues with getting their hands on bid documents and obtaining information freely for government bidding. So many barriers, loopholes, private companies treating government information as their prized proprietary assets. Do not get me started. Well, David Snyder from the First Amendment Coalition in California joins us in a moment to talk about freedom of information. You, our esteemed listeners, have possibly filed FOIA requests. You understand the process. Well, as a refresher for you, or if you aren't entirely versed on why, except in certain scenarios, you're entitled to access government information, well, David Snyder helps us fill in some of the blanks. And David, he's a lawyer, he's a journalist. Last November, he was named executive director of the First Amendment Coalition. The First Amendment Coalition, by the way, they're focused on free speech and open government. Sounds good to me. Well, what about you? Prior to his current position, David was an attorney in the San Francisco office of Shepard, Mullen, Richter, and Hampton. Included in his practice were litigation and counseling in the areas of First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and also access to government information, the California Public Records Act, federal FOIA, along with intellectual property as well. So David clearly has background appropriate to our conversation. And here's my visit with David.
Thanks, David, for joining us here on the Big Bid Theory. And I don't know, maybe a few of our audience members realize you got your bachelor's degree at the University of Texas here in Austin. Do you recall, as I sit here in our studio, it's about 102 degrees outside. Do you remember these blissful days in Austin?
Oh, yes, I do. I remember fondly sweating 24 hours a day for about 6 years that I was there.
Yeah, I think it rained 2 weeks ago. I may be mistaken. But anyway, let's get to the matter at hand. And let's start with a basic, David. Please describe to our listeners for what FOIA requests are used.
Well, I think it would be helpful to start out with a basic outline of what FOIA is to describe what it does and what it's used for. FOIA is a federal statute, the Freedom of Information Act, and it sets a presumption that the documents and records in the control or custody or possession of a federal agency are subject to disclosure. So that means records that the federal government has are presumed to be available to anyone who asks for them from the public. That can be private entities, it can be individuals, anyone can ask for records under FOIA. And the presumption is only that, it's a presumption. There are a long list of exceptions to disclosure under FOIA that require or at least allow a federal agency to withhold all or part of whatever anybody requests. So anyone can ask for anything from a federal agency. The question really comes down to what's actually disclosable and what the agency is going to produce. But so what FOIA is used for As I said, anybody can ask for records. A fair number of records requesters are journalists and those who work for watchdog organizations. They want to understand the inner workings of government, so they submit a FOIA request to get information that might not be otherwise generally publicly available, but should be disclosed under FOIA. Private companies increasingly play a huge role in FOIA. And the most recent numbers I saw showed that reporters, media outlets have become actually a relatively small portion of those who request data and records under FOIA, something like 8%, whereas private entities are taking up a much larger piece of the pie of requests that are submitted under FOIA. And so private companies may seek information that can give them an advantage in the marketplace. That's a fairly common use of FOIA. They may seek information that they need in order to improve their programs or improve their business standing. So really, the gamut is wide with respect to what can be requested under FOIA. The question again boils down to what are you actually going to get? That's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where a lot of the fights happen with respect to what FOIA requires to be released and what it doesn't.
You mentioned a moment ago, David, how it can't be a free-for-all. You know, there is obviously some government information that needs to be protected. Once upon a time, I served in the military for 9.5 years, and clearly there's some information that can't go public. So what types of information, kind of a 35,000-foot view, what types of information by law, by code, are protected from FOIA requests?
So the exemption list itself is fairly short, 6 or 7 items, but those 6 or 7 items can encompass a huge range of documents. So the most commonly invoked exceptions, these are reasons that the government will provide for not disclosing information, are number one is probably private personal information. So information that relates to an individual and that could expose that individual to an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy, that information is subject to withholding. National security information that relates to national security or could in some way threaten national security, that's another commonly invoked exception under FOIA. Law enforcement records that could jeopardize an ongoing investigation. That's another of the biggies. But as I said, each of those exemptions, although they comprise maybe a sentence or two in the code itself, they really can operate much more broadly than that. And to the dismay of many records requesters, they often are employed much more broadly than that.
The FOIA process itself, as we communicated prior to your visit, David, you pointed out that the process hasn't changed much over the years. Essentially, it's request, wait, response, and then potential appeal/litigation. Now, I've come to know, and many in our audience are aware because a number of our listeners work in and around the government. Well, the number of FOIA requests is on the rise. As a matter of fact, in preparation for our visit, I just did a couple of random searches and found that the U.S. Department of Agriculture processed over 23,000 FOIA requests in fiscal year 2016. That's solely the Department of Ag, by the way, and the Department of Defense was well over 52,000 in the same fiscal year. Now, as you pointed out to me earlier this week, delays have become an issue for some government entities. Cover for our audience, what are a few of the reasons for the delays?
Yeah, as you said, the number of requests has really sharply increased, and also the number of backlogged requests has sharply increased just in the last 5 or 6 years. And by backlogged, I mean requests that are not responded to within the 20 working day deadline that FOIA puts in place. So the total number of FOIA requests increased. In 2009, this is for all federal agencies. It was something like 550,000 requests. By 2016, that had gone up to very close to 800,000. So you see a 50% increase in the total number of FOIA requests. At the same time, Congress has not allocated, as a general matter, they haven't allocated a comparable amount or a comparable increase in funding it costs money and time is money to respond to FOIA requests. And so when more requests come in, either you get greater resources to deal with them, or the requests that come in have to wait. And so because the funding as a general matter hasn't gone up across these agencies, the wait times have increased. And, that has a detrimental effect on the operation of FOIA. The purpose of FOIA is to get government information out and to get it out as promptly as possible. There's, as I said, a 20 working day deadline that agencies have to comply with. And if they don't comply with that, that's a violation of the statute, which potentially subjects the agency to litigation. And so as the backlog increases and as the delays increase, I think you also see an increase in the amount of litigation, which of course becomes costly to both the government and to private entities or individuals who are trying to get records. And you can see a point at which this would just sort of grind to a halt. I think a lot of folks in the world I operate in, which is, my organization is dedicated to further government transparency, are concerned that FOIA is breaking down. There was a report issued by the House Committee on Government Oversight and Reform in 2016, which had as its title, FOIA is broken. And it ran through a hit parade of problems with FOIA and the way in which FOIA isn't living up to its advertised purpose. And, I don't know what the problem ultimately boils down to, but you can say that there is a volume issue. The number of requests are increasing, the resources to respond to those requests are not. And so at some point, something has to give.
In a moment, we'll talk a little bit more about predatory FOIA requests, kind of a term that we've adopted here and others are using as well. But first, kind of change gears slightly. Those familiar with the government world understand that governments outsource. Governments buy anything and everything, and oftentimes governments outsource. At the federal level, state, local, doesn't matter. Some entities have outsourced management and processing of data to businesses, and a few examples are data processing functions, permitting's another one. Also, we're the big bid theory. Government purchasing is also components of government purchasing can be outsourced as well. In your opinion, David, where is the line drawn on a person's access, I'm talking about John Q. Public, to data related to government purchasing? In part, with our governments outsourcing this data to private companies, are those companies then exempt from FOIA?
Well, private entities are exempt from direct FOIA requests. So if you want to request something from Apple computers by FOIA, you're just going to get silence. There's no obligation that private entities have to respond to FOIA requests themselves. But the point that you're highlighting is that there are a lot of private entities that handle government records and deal with government records. And those government records are subject to FOIA. And so what happens if you submit a request to the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Agriculture says these records are not in our offices in Washington, D.C. or on our servers, they're in the possession of a private company that the Department of Agriculture has contracted with to perform some service. And the question of what records that are not directly in the possession of the government agency but are in the possession of a private entity, which of those records are subject to disclosure, is one that's the law in this area is somewhat unsettled, and it can really boil down to a case-by-case, intensely factual analysis. But there are a few guideposts that I think apply. One is if an agency has the legal ability to obtain the records that you're seeking. In other words, if their contract with the private entity says, for example, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has the ability at any time to obtain the records at issue in this contract. If there's a clear statement like that in the contract that the agency really still has the legal right to get the records, then I think those records would be subject to disclosure under FOIA. In other words, the Department of Agriculture would have an obligation, because it has the right, to get the records that you're seeking from the private entity and then produce them to you. But it's often not that simple. It's not always clear what the government agency's obligations and rights are with respect to the records that it has sort of contracted out to a private entity. And so one test that courts have considered, and I'm frankly not sure whether this is, I don't think this is the law at this point, although I think there are some courts that have held that this is the case. I'm not sure it's clearly uniformly the law. Possession, custody, or control is one potential point of analysis for this. So does the agency have possession, custody, or control of the records? If so, then it may be required to disclose those records. But again, that word control is one that sounds, it's a fairly short word and it sounds fairly simple, but it depends on the case. It depends on what the contract says. It depends on what the ongoing relationship between the government agency and the private entity is. Does the agency really have control over the records? Well, that's something that probably or might likely end up in court and be argued about.
We'll certainly keep our eye on that. It's an interesting scenario, in my opinion. A moment ago, David, we talked about, and again, we use the term predatory FOIA requests, and we've already established the fact that the number of requests is growing, and it's probably not going to drop in the foreseeable future. And I cite one example, the folks in the town of Gulfstream, Florida. They're well aware of this issue where the town of Gulfstream was overwhelmed by the number of requests they were getting, and it can destroy budgets, especially for small agencies, small town cities, et cetera. In terms of the magnitude of FOIA requests that are coming in, are there protections available to agencies? Is there anything on the books right now that can protect these governments from being overwhelmed?
Well, there's nothing in FOIA that I know of, or in the case law interpreting FOIA, that says that an agency is entitled to just ignore a request if it has determined that the request comes from a requester who is predatory. And so I don't know that there's a clear answer in the law that says the agency can just not respond if it feels that the request is part of a sort of campaign to immobilize that agency. But what I can say is that in the practical world, in a practical sense, what happens often with agencies who have too many requests is they simply don't respond because they don't have the manpower. FOIA doesn't require an agency to go out and hire people in order to respond to requests. And so agencies operate with the manpower that they have. And, so let's say they have 3 people who work 8-hour days, 5 days a week. Those people can be devoted to responding to FOIA requests, but when they go home for the night or for the weekend, the requests that continue to flow in pile up. And that's not a happy circumstance for anybody, for legitimate records requesters, for the government. But I don't know what the answer is. And I don't have a good sense of how broad a problem predatory FOIA requests are. That may be a function of again, the world that I operate in, where my organization advocates for government transparency. And so the problem that I see is that government agencies, particularly at the federal level, but also at the state level, are not responding quickly enough or thoroughly enough to records requests. Are there records requesters that are abusing the system? I have no doubt that there are. I have not seen indication that this is an overwhelming problem. In other words, that the increasing number of requests is a function of requesters who are just trying to gum up the system. I think, in my view and based on my knowledge and experience, it's more a function of the government not having adequate resources to respond to legitimate requests. For requests that are not necessarily intentionally submitted in order to, as I said, gum up the system, but are just overbroad because the requester doesn't really know exactly how to ask for what they're looking for. One solution for government agencies is to simply work with the requester, reach out to the requester and say, well, what is it you're actually looking for? Because your request encompasses a huge range of documents, but I suspect you probably don't want all of those. The more government and requesters can work together sort of outside or to the side of the formalized system in order to come to some common agreement about what the government agency has and what the requester wants, the better.
As everybody who's been a listener to the show for the past few years understand that we are fully on board in terms of calling for transparency in government. One of the documents I read was Florida Tax Watch's January 2016 report, and incidentally, that's where I came across the situation in Gulfstream, Florida, and how they're being overwhelmed. So it's your contention that those are isolated cases?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied the issue in detail, but I haven't seen anyone suggest that there's an overwhelming problem with abusive FOIA requests. And again, that may be because of the world that I operate in. It's not something that we're focused on day in and day out. And it may be that if I talk to if I worked with and talked regularly with the agencies who respond to these requests, I might have a different viewpoint. But
Sure.
as far as I know, abusive requests are the outliers. That the instance that you're talking about in Florida, which by the way I think there you're talking about Florida's open government law, which is similar to FOIA but not exactly the same. Each of the 50 states has their own Public Records Act or Public Records Law that governs these issues, and many of them are similar or virtually the same as FOIA, but there can be important differences. The fundamental issue you run up against is who gets to determine whether a request is part of an abusive campaign, and by what standard do they make that determination, and then what do they do about it. The problem from a requester's perspective and from a transparency advocate's perspective is that if it's the government agency itself which gets to make that determination, you could see how that could be quickly abused, and that a government agency could simply say, well, we don't like this guy because he's asking for too many records, so we're going to stop responding to him. That's not a happy
No.
resolution of that, and I don't think it's consistent with the objectives of FOIA. That said, I understand the problems with overburdensome requests. I think the issue is how do you deal with that? And I think the way many agencies have dealt with too many requests is they simply don't respond because they can't. They don't have the resources to do so.
Our audience, they become big fans of what we consider our crystal ball segment. Look into the future, look beyond the horizon. Where do you predict FOIA is going to be 5 to 10 years down the road?
Very interesting question. And it's hard to predict because it's hard to predict what Congress is going to do. But I think if things remain as they are, if Congress doesn't allocate more money to the FOIA efforts of federal agencies, and if the requests keep coming in at the rate that they've been coming in, I think the worst case scenario is that FOIA becomes essentially useless for purposes of a requester, because the delays become so long and the non-responses become so common that those who would request information from the government simply throw up their hands, say it's not even worth the effort. And I sincerely hope that is not what ultimately happens, because I think FOIA is an absolutely critical engine to promote government transparency and to allow all of us to see what our elected leaders are doing in our name. It really is central to the democratic project and to the American project that the voters understand what their government's doing, and in particular what their government's doing wrong, in order to address those problems. So, you could see a world, if you were pessimistic, and I do my best to avoid that perspective, but if you were pessimistic and you said, well, if things just kind of keep going the way they're going, in 10 or 15 years, these wheels will just grind to a halt. So something has to give. Congress has to allocate more resources to FOIA offices so that they can do what they're required to do under the statute. It's possible that some amendments to FOIA could ease the burden on government agencies in a way that doesn't also restrict the flow of information. I don't have any specific solutions on that, but people who are much smarter than me and who spend more time directly looking at FOIA statute might have ideas about how the statute could be amended in order to accomplish that goal. But FOIA itself needs to survive, and it needs to get better than the way the operation of FOIA needs to improve from what it is now. in order for it to really fulfill its obligations and for the government to fulfill its requirements under FOIA.
We have an appreciation and respect for what you're doing to focus on free speech and open government. We sure do appreciate you sharing your expertise with our audience. Let me ask you this. If anyone listening wants more information on the First Amendment Coalition, FOIA, or if you're willing to share your contact information, what should our listeners do to track down you or the First Amendment Coalition?
Yeah, we have a website online. It's firstamendmentcoalition.org. Or if you just Google First Amendment Coalition, it'll take you right there. Our phone number at FAC is 415-460-5060. My contact information, direct contact information, is available on the website. People are welcome to reach out there. There are a number of great resources about FOIA online.
As our audience understands, our producers, Lauren and Braden, they'll be sure to include that info in the description of the podcast. So again, David, thanks very much for visiting with us, and hopefully our paths will cross again down the road at some point.
Thank you very much. I was happy to be here. I'm glad you're shedding light on this issue.
Some thought-provoking words there from David. Thanks again. Speaking of stimulation for the brain, we all, of course, think of Jim Ward as, the rugged world traveler, a man of the people, tough, hard-nosed, a bring-it-on kind of guy. Well, Jim, like most people, he has his own fears, topics which trouble him. This installment of Crazy Bids exposes one of Jim's fears.
Crazy bids, crazy bids, crazy bids that you can win.
Well, hello, good looking. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. This is the 4,752nd edition of Crazy Bids That You Can Win. I am the conductor of the Crazy Bid. My name is the Jim Ward, and this is actually another crazy tender that you can win. Now, I have been getting contacted by some somewhat strange people, misunderstanding because we've been doing so many crazy tenders. These are tenders with an E, not with an I. So no, I will not send you more pictures. And I'd appreciate it if this is just for governments purchasing goods and services. First off, I want to thank my dear friend Rajesh, a tender tracker, who helped me find this crazy tender.
Rajesh, no more pics.
Okay, great guy, but no more pics. It's not that tender. So this one is for animal husbandry, as I said. Now the state it's for, Jharkhand, is 25% of the population is below the poverty level. It's a rough gig.
I understand.
So they have to, I guess, get creative. So the whole idea of animal husbandry, it freaks me out, and I don't know why. It kind of freaks me out that it freaks me out. I'm sure there's a condition with a name, but if I'm watching National Geographic and they start showing two zebras having sex, I'm probably going to turn the channel. I don't know. I don't need to know that hippopotamus have sex a certain way because and look and the beauty of nature. Nay, I throw down. I don't want to because it freaks me out. So the idea, first off, that somebody loves animal sex so much that they specialize in it. Wow. And I'm not saying that there's not a need for these people that really, really enjoy animal sex. And, in this case, the livestock, breeding is as much food for the people as possible. And I understand that. Now, where it kind of creeps me out a little bit is Jharkhand is well known for its crossbreeding of its livestock, and I could rattle off the names of the different types of animals that have been bred together, but just trust me on this one. Yuck.
Yuck, and then yuck again.
So I guess they're crossbreeding. If it's like any other, agricultural activity, you want your harvest done as quickly as possible so you can have another one, right? So they probably want to have the as quickly as possible between the animals. Now, I don't want to even think about it, but I'm forced to. I wonder if somehow they get them all riled up by showing them. I don't know. I have no idea where I'm going, and I'm kind of grossing myself out. But somebody could answer that who's into animal husbandry. It's just not me. So in the past, I've brought you, crazy bids that you can win, but also more than one crazy bids that Jim will win, mostly art related. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is definitely not NOT, a crazy tender that Jim can win. In fact, I'm curious who bids on these. I seriously am, because that fascinates me that somebody, out of all the things you could study, as we've talked about before, I am the proverbial art student who's an art major. Yes, thank you. Somebody out there, though, when they went to school, they looked at all the opportunities. They thought, there's the arts, there's economics, there's geography, I don't know. But how about animal sex? You guys have anything on that? As a matter of fact, we do. Welcome to the world of animal husbandry. Yikes. So there you have it. This episode's crazy bid that you can win. Again, my name is the Jim Ward, and I want to thank you for tuning in. All the feedback has been great.
Crazy bids, crazy bids, crazy bids that you can win.
All right, Bill, thanks so much. Take it back into the studio.
Top 3? Tell me our informal poll wasn't right. And thanks again to Jim Ward. And many thanks to you. We appreciate you downloading and following The Big Bid Theory, as always. Please continue to send your emails to me at bculhane@bidprime.com. And Jim responds to his email activity as soon as possible, a busy guy. He's at jward@bidprime.com. The show's Twitter is at The Big Bid Theory. My Twitter handle is contract_hunter. JW, Jim, he's Jim Ward, the number 6, Jim Ward 6. And also, as you know, we accepted Mark Zuckerberg's invitation and we're on Facebook as well. Thanks again to David Snyder from the First Amendment Coalition. For Jim Ward and our TBBT staff right now emailing their elected representatives calling for keeping information free to the people. Until the next episode, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
We're having so much fun.